The hallway no longer exists, but the silence it held never left. Long after the doors were sealed and the walls torn down, something about that place continued to follow those who knew it. Families still wake at night thinking of unanswered questions. Staff still hesitate when walking past where the wing once stood. There was no final scream, no dramatic ending, no moment where everything made sense. Just a quiet conclusion that arrived years too late. Tonight this story reaches its end, but endings do not always bring peace. Sometimes they only reveal how close danger can live to normal life. What happened inside that hospital did not end with an arrest or a demolition. It left a warning that lingers in every quiet corridor and every trusted routine. Because when silence protects harm, the truth does not disappear. It waits. The hospital stood quiet under the pale glow of parking lot lights. Windows reflected nothing but darkness. Inside, one wing remained sealed for years, untouched and unexplained. Nurses avoided looking at it when passing nearby. Doctors lowered their voices when its name surfaced. Patients were never told why an entire section of a modern American hospital had been closed overnight. No fire, no collapse, no official incident. Yet people had died there. And some say not all of them were accounted for. Before the closure, the hospital was known as a place of healing. Families trusted it. Staff took pride in it. The West Wing in particular was considered calm and efficient. Long white corridors, soft lighting, private rooms, it housed patients with routine conditions. Recoveries were expected, death was not. Then over a short span of months, something changed. Patients began to decline without warning. Vital signs dropped. Charts showed confusion. Nurses reported unease they could not explain. And then one night the wing was shut down completely. Daniel Reeves was an orderly assigned to the West Wing during its final weeks. He worked night shifts. He knew the rhythm of the place, the slow beeping of monitors, the hum of machines, the soft footsteps in hallways. He noticed the first death was dismissed quietly. An elderly man, no alarm. The second followed days later. A woman recovering from minor surgery. Then a third, younger, no prior complications. Each time the cause was listed as natural. Yet Daniel saw patterns others ignored. The patients who died shared nothing obvious. Different doctors, different diagnoses, different rooms. But Daniel noticed timing. All deaths occurred between 1 and 3 in the morning. Always when staffing was lowest. Always when the wing felt unnaturally still. He mentioned it once to a nurse supervisor. She told him not to speculate. He mentioned it again after the 4th death. He was warned to focus on his duties. Families began asking questions. One man demanded to see surveillance footage after his sister passed unexpectedly. He was told the cameras were down. Another family requested a transfer of records. They received incomplete files. Missing notes, blank, times. The hospital administration responded with rehearse.com. Investigations were promised. Explanations delayed. Then suddenly the wing was closed. Doors locked, signs removed, staff reassigned. Official statements cited renovation needs, electrical upgrades, structural review. No timeline was given. No press conference held. Patients were moved overnight. Equipment left behind. Beds remained made. Charts still inside drawers. The wing was frozen in time. Daniel was transferred to another department. He never returned to that corridor, but he never forgot it. Months passed, no renovations began. Years passed. The wing remained sealed. New staff were hired who never worked there. Older staff stopped talking. Hospital tours avoided that side of the building. When asked, new administrators claimed it had always been closed. Records of the wing slowly vanished from public documents. Floor maps were updated. Room numbers skipped from east to north. The West Wing became a blank space. Daniel tried to move on. Yet the memories stayed. He remembered the smell, the silence, the way machines seemed louder there. He remembered one patient in particular, a young woman named Emily Carter. She was admitted for observation only. Stable. Laughing earlier that evening. By morning, she was gone. No alarms triggered, no code called. Just absence. Her chart listed cardiac failure. Daniel had checked her vitals himself hours before. They were normal. Years later, Daniel searched for news, obituaries, lawsuits, anything. He found little. Families had settled quietly. Non-disclosure agreements signed. A few had moved away. One nurse who had spoken openly resigned suddenly and left the state. Another retired early, citing stress. The doctors involved advanced their careers elsewhere. The hospital expanded. New wings opened. Yet the sealed corridor remained untouched. Urban explorers later claimed to glimpse it through locked doors. Dust-covered floors. Equipment outdated. Chairs still positioned beside beds. One claimed to hear a monitor beep, though the power was disconnected. Another said the air felt heavy. None could stay long. Security cameras near the wing malfunctioned often. Guards avoided patrols there at night. Daniel eventually spoke to an independent journalist. He described what he saw. The timing, the patterns, the silence that followed. The journalist filed information requests. Most were denied. Some returned redacted. Then the journalists stopped responding. Emails bounced, calls went unanswered. The article was never published. To this day, the hospital operates fully. Patients come and go. Lives are saved, births celebrated. Yet one wing remains closed. No plaque, no explanation, no acknowledgement. Just a locked corridor behind painted walls. Those who worked there remember. Those who lost someone still wonder. And those who pass nearby at night swear the lights flicker sometimes where no power should exist. This is the beginning of a story buried under policy and silence. A story of unexplained deaths and missing records. A story where healing turned into something else. And as we continue, you will learn what investigators later uncovered, what the hospital tried to erase, and why some doors were never meant to be reopened. The investigation began quietly long before anyone outside the hospital noticed. At first, it was just internal reviews held behind closed doors with clipped voices and careful language. Charts were audited, then refiled. Staff interviews were summarized, then sealed. Administrators assured everyone that nothing criminal had occurred. But behind that calm tone, something deeper was unfolding. Nurse notes ended abruptly hours before her death. When her parents asked for full disclosure, they were told the records no longer existed in complete form. At the same time, a junior hospital administrator named Laura Mitchell noticed inconsistencies while compiling annual reports. The West Wing statistics did not align with other departments. Mortality rates were slightly higher, but not enough to trigger automatic review. What caught her attention was timing. Nearly all deaths occurred during the same overnight window. She flagged it internally. The response came quickly. She was told the data was misinterpreted and advised to move on. Police involvement was minimal at first. Deaths inside hospitals often fall into gray areas where responsibility blurs between medicine and law. Local authorities relied on hospital reviews and death certificates. No autopsies were ordered beyond routine examinations. No crime scenes were preserved. Rooms were cleaned immediately. Equipment reused. Any chance of early evidence vanished quietly. Still whispers spread among night staff. Nurses talked about sudden drops in blood pressure. Machines that alarmed briefly then went silent. IV bags that seemed lighter than expected. One nurse claimed she found a medication tray unlocked with missing vials. She reported it and was placed on leave pending evaluation. She never returned. Security logs later revealed odd patterns. Keycard access showed repeated late-night entries into patient rooms by a single unidentified card number. The card was never assigned officially. IT records claimed corruption. Logs were incomplete. Backup data was overwritten. When questioned, security supervisors said the system had been upgraded since then, and older records were unreliable. As weeks passed, pressure mounted quietly. Hospital attorneys stepped in. Meetings with families ended in settlements. Documents were signed. Silence followed. Those who refused were told legal processes would take years. Some accepted out of exhaustion. Others felt pushed into corners they could not escape. Behind the scenes, a private consulting firm was hired. Their role was never announced. They interviewed select staff under confidentiality agreements. They reviewed pharmacy records and medication orders. Their final report was delivered directly to hospital leadership and never released. Shortly afterward, 2 senior administrators resigned, citing personal reasons. Years later, fragments of that report surfaced indirectly. A former consultant spoke anonymously to an investigative podcast. He described a pattern that suggested intentional interference with medication delivery. Not random errors, not system failures, but calculated timing and access. Someone had known exactly when staffing was lowest and monitoring weakest. Attention turned to the pharmacy. Controlled substances were audited. Records showed discrepancies too small to trigger alarms, but consistent over time. A missing dose here, a delayed entry there. Enough to matter if used repeatedly. But no individual was named. Responsibility dissolved into process gaps and oversight failures. Daniel Reeves followed these developments from a distance. He recognized the descriptions immediately. He remembered the unlocked carts, the silent rooms, the feeling that something was wrong long before anyone said it aloud. He reached out again to authorities. His statement was taken, but nothing followed. Then something unexpected happened. A patient from another hospital came forward. She described nearly identical symptoms years later. Same overnight decline. Same unexplained silence. That hospital shared a former staff member with the West Wing, a name that had never appeared publicly before. Someone who had transferred shortly before the closure. Records showed the individual had left healthcare entirely soon after. No disciplinary action. No criminal charges. Just disappearance into anonymity. Investigators attempted to locate them. The trail went cold quickly. Addresses outdated. Employment records sparse. As if the person had stepped out of the system entirely. The deeper investigators dug, the more resistance they faced. Files delayed, requests denied, witnesses reluctant. It became clear that whatever happened in the West Wing was not just a medical mystery. It was something protected. Something buried intentionally, and as attention slowly returned to that sealed corridor, one question refused to fade. The witnesses came forward reluctantly. Years of silence had taught them what speaking could cost. Careers ended, reputations questioned, stability threatened. Yet time had weakened the grip of fear, and distance made memory harder to ignore. One by one, former staff members agreed to talk under condition of anonymity. Their stories differed in detail but aligned in feeling. Something deliberate had happened in the West Wing, and everyone had sensed it even before they understood it. A former night nurse described how patients would appear stable during evening rounds, then deteriorate suddenly after midnight. Monitors would show brief irregularities, then flatten without the prolonged alarms usually seen in cardiac events. She said it felt controlled, as if someone knew exactly how far to push the body without triggering immediate alerts. She recalled finding IV lines adjusted differently than she had left them. Flow rates changed. Bags nearly empty earlier than expected. Another witness was a respiratory therapist who covered multiple departments. He remembered being called to the West Wing repeatedly for patients who should not have needed intervention. Their oxygen levels dropped without explanation. When he arrived, equipment appeared normal. Filters clean, tubing intact. He said it felt as though the air itself had been taken from them briefly, then returned. The most unsettling testimony came from a former pharmacy technician. She described irregular medication requests that technically followed protocol but felt unnecessary. Dosages adjusted late at night. Orders signed electronically by physicians who were not physically present. When she questioned one request, she was told it had already been approved and to process it quickly. Later, she realized the order had been altered minutes after initial entry. Patterns emerged when investigators laid these accounts side by side. The same hours, the same types of medications, sedatives, anticoagulants, and cardiac suppressants used in precise combinations. Not enough to immediately kill, enough to weaken, enough to confuse symptoms, enough to allow natural causes to be written convincingly. Early theories shifted. This was not a malfunctioning wing, not environmental contamination, not bad luck. It was targeted manipulation of care. But the question remained, why? There was no clear financial motive. No insurance fraud, no organ harvesting, nothing that fit common criminal templates. Another theory suggested psychological compulsion, a caregiver seeking control, power over life and death without spectacle. Someone who blended into routine, someone trusted, someone who understood systems well enough to exploit their blind spots. The overnight hours provided cover, reduced staffing, slower response times, fewer witnesses. Investigators revisited staffing schedules. A single name appeared repeatedly across critical nights. A senior nurse who had worked multiple departments. Highly rated, under pressure. Respected by peers. Rarely questioned. That nurse had transferred shortly before the closure. Their employment record showed glowing evaluations and no disciplinary notes. Yet colleagues now recalled subtle things. An eagerness to volunteer for extra shifts. A preference for working alone. A habit of dismissing concerns confidently. Surveillance footage could have answered many questions, but it was gone. Hard drives overwritten, backup tapes missing. Official explanation cited routine data retention limits. Yet footage from other wings during the same period still existed. Only the West Wing recordings were lost. Families who had accepted settlements began speaking again when these patterns surfaced. They compared notes privately. Times of death. Staff present, symptoms described. The similarities were impossible to ignore. A group hired an independent analyst who concluded the probability of coincidence was extremely low. Despite this momentum, formal charges never came. Prosecutors cited lack of direct evidence. Too much time had passed. Key records destroyed. Witnesses hesitant. Without a confession or physical proof, the case remained circumstantial. Then an unexpected detail surfaced. A former patient from the West Wing had survived a sudden decline and later requested her full records. Buried in the file was a handwritten note that did not match any staff handwriting samples. It mentioned an adjustment made during the night that was never documented elsewhere. That note became a focal point. Handwriting experts could not identify the author, but confirmed it was written in the wing during the relevant period. The ink matched hospital supply. The paper matched chart stock. Someone had left a trace without realizing it. This discovery reopened internal debate. Hospital leadership resisted. Legal teams intervened. Yet pressure mounted externally. Advocacy groups demanded transparency. Media interest grew cautiously. The sealed wing returned to public awareness, but the closer investigators came to naming responsibility, the more obstacles appeared. Witnesses withdrew. Statements were revised. Fear resurfaced. Someone still had influence. Someone still wanted the past buried, and just as momentum peaked, something else happened. A former staff member died under unexplained circumstances. Ruled accidental. Timing suspicious. Details scarce. It sent a message without words. As the theory narrowed toward a single individual, the stakes rose sharply, because proving intent would expose more than one crime. It would expose systemic failure, complicity, and a willingness to sacrifice truth for reputation. Next, you will hear how the case was reopened officially, what new evidence shocked investigators, and why the sealed wing became the center of a confrontation no one could avoid anymore. The case was reopened quietly without announcements or press statements. No sirens, no headlines, just a series of sealed meetings and renewed document requests. Authorities understood that public attention too early could collapse what little cooperation still existed. The West Wing was officially reclassified as an active point of interest. For the first time in years, investigators were granted limited access beyond the locked doors. When the seal was broken, the air inside felt stale and unmoving. Dust coated the floors and equipment exactly as it had been left. Beds remained aligned, curtains half-drawn, chairs positioned beside where families once sat. It was not abandoned chaos, it was preserved absence. Investigators photographed everything. They noted something unsettling. Clocks inside the wing all showed different times. None had been reset. Each had stopped on a different night. Forensic teams focused on medication, storage areas, and waste disposal points. Beneath the sink panel, they discovered residue traces that should not have been there. Minute quantities of substances inconsistent with logged usage. Too small to trigger alarms individually. Together, they formed a pattern. It suggested repeated exposure rather than a single event. A breakthrough came from an unexpected source. A retired maintenance worker remembered being called repeatedly to fix a faulty door sensor during overnight hours. The logs showed maintenance requests, but no permanent repair was ever made. Investigators realized the sensor failure created blind spots in access records. Anyone entering certain rooms during that window would not be logged properly. Attention returned to staff access cards. Analysts reconstructed fragments of corrupted data. They found overlapping access timestamps that could only occur if a master override card was used. That card had not been officially assigned to any nurse or doctor. It belonged to administration and was meant only for emergencies. Usage of it during routine nights raised immediate concern. Investigators subpoenaed archived emails. Many had been deleted. Some recovered partially. In one exchange, a senior administrator expressed concern about overnight deviations and instructed another to handle the matter internally to avoid escalation. The language was vague, but the intent was clear. Problems were to be contained, not exposed. Pressure mounted when a former executive agreed to speak under immunity. They admitted leadership had been warned of unusual mortality clustering. Consultants had recommended immediate suspension of specific staff pending review. That recommendation was rejected. Closing the wing was seen as safer than confronting the implications of wrongdoing. The most shocking discovery came from pharmacy audit reconstruction. By correlating supplier shipment data with patient outcomes, investigators found mismatches that aligned precisely with death timelines. Medications had been diverted in controlled amounts over months. Someone had manipulated inventory without triggering automatic alerts. It required knowledge and access beyond a single role. As evidence accumulated, a name surfaced again and again. The same individual witnesses hesitated to identify earlier. A respected senior caregiver with extensive experience and unrestricted access. Their file showed sudden resignation shortly before the closure. No exit interview, no forwarding address. Their professional license was never revoked. Investigators tracked financial records. Nothing unusual, no sudden wealth, no obvious motive. That absence itself became disturbing. The behavior did not align with profit-driven crime. Psychological experts consulted on the case proposed a different explanation: control without reward. A pattern of quiet dominance exercised in isolation. Power expressed invisibly. Attempts to locate the individual failed repeatedly. They had changed names legally, moved states, left healthcare. It appeared intentional, as if they knew the moment scrutiny would come. That knowledge suggested warning. Someone inside had tipped them off. Public disclosure became inevitable. Families were notified the case had been reopened. Emotions reignited. Anger replaced resignation. Media coverage followed cautiously. The hospital issued a statement denying wrongdoing while expressing sympathy. Behind the scenes, legal teams prepared for fallout. Then another discovery shifted everything. A sealed storage room contained boxes labeled incorrectly. Inside were archived patient wristbands and partial charts that should have been destroyed. Among them was Emily Carter wristband. It should not have been there. Its presence meant someone had retained items intentionally. This discovery confirmed what many feared. The wing was not closed to protect patients. It was closed to protect secrets. And those secrets involved decisions made at the highest levels. As investigators prepared warrants and expanded their search, the atmosphere changed. Cooperation tightened. Silence returned. Doors closed again figuratively, if not physically. Because in the next part, you will hear how the truth finally surfaced. How one moment, one confession, and one mistake exposed everything. And why the consequences reached far beyond a single hospital wing into the very system meant to protect life. The night the pressure peaked, the hospital felt different. Hallways seemed narrower, lights harsher. Every step echoed longer than it should. People who had avoided the past 4 years now felt it closing in. Records were being pulled. Phones were ringing again. And somewhere inside the system, someone knew time was running out. This was no longer about whether something wrong had happened. It was about how many people had allowed it to continue. Interviews grew tense. Staff, lawyers sat in rooms where nurses once spoke freely. Former administrators stopped returning calls. Silence returned, but it felt strained rather than secure. Families felt it too. Emily Carter parents described sleepless nights filled with anger they had buried for years. Grief had turned into something sharper. They replayed memories, searching for missed signs. Phone calls that ended too quickly. Answers that felt rehearsed. The reopening of the case reopened wounds they had learned to live with. Inside the hospital, remaining staff struggled with guilt. Some realized they had noticed small things and ignored them. Others remembered moments when instinct told them something was wrong, but authority told them to trust the system. Psychologists later described it as moral erosion. Small compromises repeated until silence felt normal. Investigators mapped emotional fallout alongside evidence. They saw patterns of burnout among night staff during the final months of the West Wing. Increased sick days. Transfers requested suddenly. One nurse admitted she began having panic attacks before shifts without knowing why. She said the wing felt heavy, even during quiet nights, as if something unseen demanded attention. The pressure exposed fractures at the top. Internal emails revealed disagreements among leadership. Some wanted to involve authorities early. Others feared reputational collapse. One message warned that exposure would destroy trust in the entire institution. Another replied that trust was already gone if truth stayed hidden. That exchange marked a turning point. Psychological experts profiled the suspected caregiver more deeply. They described a pattern of quiet superiority. No anger, no chaos, just control. The acts were not impulsive. They were ritualized, repeated under identical conditions. Late hours, minimal witnesses, maximum deniability. It was not hatred of patients. It was mastery over outcomes. The theory unsettled everyone involved. It meant the harm was not accidental. It was intentional but invisible. And it meant the system had rewarded it by looking away. Promotions, praise, autonomy, all granted while lives slipped away unnoticed. As scrutiny intensified, new consequences emerged. A former administrator was found to have approved record destruction outside policy. Another had authorized early settlements with unusual urgency. Neither faced charges yet, but both were under investigation. Careers built over decades began to crumble quietly. Then came the emotional breaking point. A junior nurse who had worked briefly in the West Wing years earlier contacted investigators late one night. She had stayed silent out of fear. She said she once walked into a room and sensed something was wrong immediately. A patient was unresponsive, but monitors showed normal readings. She was told to leave the room and let senior staff handle it. She obeyed. The patient died hours later. That memory had haunted her for years. When the case reopened, she realized her silence had weight. Her testimony added another layer. Not evidence of action, but evidence of suppression. Of voices guided away from truth. Public response intensified. Advocacy groups demanded accountability beyond one individual. They questioned oversight, training, culture. How many systems relied on trust without verification? How many errors were hidden under routine language? The hospital released another statement expressing commitment to transparency, yet access remained limited. Requests delayed. Language careful. Investigators recognized the pattern. Damage control rather than disclosure. Behind closed doors, warrants were prepared. Financial penalties discussed. Regulatory agencies notified. The case had grown beyond criminal inquiry. It was now institutional reckoning. The psychological toll spread outward. Investigators described dreams of endless corridors and locked doors. Families described anger mixed with exhaustion. Even reporters covering the story spoke of unease. The West Wing had become more than a place. It was a symbol of what happens when silence is easier than truth. And then the pressure finally cracked something open, not through force, not through accusation, but through fear. One person realized protection had limits. One mistake would undo years of concealment. In the next part, you will hear about the moment that changed everything, the error that could not be covered, the truth that surfaced not by choice but by inevitability, and how the identity behind the West Wing finally stepped into the light. The mistake was small at first and almost invisible. A single form filed late by someone who believed the worst was already over. It was an administrative update connected to an old insurance settlement tied to a West Wing patient. The document referenced a staff identifier that no longer existed in active systems, but it still existed in legacy archives, and that identifier matched the master override access card investigators had been tracking for years. That connection broke the stalemate. For the first time, a direct line existed between an individual and the pattern of access that had haunted the case. Analysts cross-referenced the identifier with archived payroll systems and found a match. The name that emerged was the same one witnesses had avoided saying out loud, a senior caregiver who had once been praised for composure and dedication. Someone who had worked nights almost exclusively. Someone who had known the system well enough to bend it quietly. Investigators moved quickly. They located the individual living under a different name in another state. No criminal record. No active warrants. A quiet life far from hospitals. When questioned, the person appeared calm, cooperative, almost relieved. There was no denial at first, just careful language and long pauses. During the interview, the truth surfaced slowly, not as a dramatic confession but as a controlled explanation. The individual described the West Wing as a place where everything slowed down, where time felt manageable, where decisions felt absolute. They spoke of correcting outcomes, of intervening when bodies became unpredictable. They never used the word kill. They used words like adjustment and balance. Psychologists later noted the absence of guilt. There was no visible anger or excitement, just certainty. The belief that control was necessary, that no one was harmed intentionally because harm was not acknowledged. Patients were described as processes rather than people. The wing had become a private domain where rules softened. The individual admitted to manipulating medication flow rates and timing, to adjusting dosages in ways that would weaken without immediate detection. They explained the overnight window was chosen for efficiency, not secrecy. Fewer interruptions, fewer questions. They claimed they never intended deaths to occur, but accepted them as outcomes when control slipped. When asked why they stopped, the answer was simple. The system changed. Oversight increased. Attention grew. Control diminished. Leaving was the logical choice. The closure of the wing was described not as a reaction to guilt, but as a failure of environment. The place no longer functioned as intended. The revelation sent shockwaves through the investigation. Charges were prepared carefully. Legal teams weighed mental health defenses. Prosecutors debated intent. The complexity of the case meant resolution would be slow, but the truth was no longer abstract. It had a voice, a face, a history. Attention then turned upward. Who knew? Who suspected? Who chose silence? Emails and testimonies showed leadership had not known specifics, but had recognized risk. They chose containment over exposure. The wing was closed to stop further harm and to avoid uncovering how long it had gone unnoticed. Families were informed in private meetings. Reactions varied. Some felt relief. Others felt anger deepen. Knowing who was responsible did not restore what was lost. It only clarified that loss had been preventable. The hospital faced regulatory action, fines, oversight, mandatory reforms, training programs rewritten, access systems redesigned. The sealed wing was scheduled for permanent demolition rather than reopening. It would be erased physically, just as it had been erased on paper. Yet the most unsettling consequence was psychological. Staff across the country questioned assumptions they had relied on for years. Trust in routine, trust in authority, trust that systems always protected the vulnerable. The West Wing became a case study in how harm can hide inside normalcy. The individual was taken into custody quietly. No spectacle, no cameras, just a car leaving a quiet street at dawn. The case entered the courts where timelines stretched and outcomes remained uncertain. But the story was no longer hidden. The silence had broken, not because truth was welcomed, but because it could no longer be contained. And still, one question lingered unresolved. How many signs had been seen and ignored before it was too late? And how many other places relied on the same silence to survive? Because in the final part, you will hear what happened after the doors were finally closed for good. How those left behind tried to live with what they knew. And why the West Wing remains a warning rather than a memory. The final morning came without ceremony, no announcement, no crowd, just workers arriving before sunrise to begin sealing the West Wing permanently. For years, the corridor had existed as a question mark inside the hospital. Now it was about to disappear. Walls would be reinforced. doorways filled, the space erased, not reopened, as if removing it physically could quiet what it had come to represent. But even before the first tool touched concrete, the weight of the past was already present, heavy and unmovable. Families were notified quietly that the case had reached its final stage. Some were told in brief phone calls, others through letters written in careful language. There would be no dramatic trial, no public recounting of every detail. Legal resolutions moved slowly and largely out of view. For many families, the truth arrived too late to feel like justice. It answered questions but reopened wounds that had scarred imperfectly. Emily Carter's parents visited the hospital one last time. They stood near the area where the West Wing had once begun. There was no sign, no plaque, just a blank wall and a hallway that turned away. They did not ask for access. They did not want to see the rooms. What mattered was knowing that their daughter had not simply vanished into bad luck, that something had been wrong, that their doubts had been justified, even if acknowledgement came years later. Staff members who had worked those nights carried a different kind of aftermath. Some left healthcare entirely. Others stayed but spoke of changed instincts. They questioned more, documented everything, trusted less easily. Many described a loss of innocence they did not know they had possessed. The belief that systems always caught danger had been replaced by the knowledge that systems were built and maintained by people, and people could choose silence. The hospital itself survived. Institutions often do. New leadership took over. Policies were rewritten. Training emphasized reporting and redundancy. Access controls were tightened. Audits became routine. On paper, it became safer than before. But among staff there remained an unspoken awareness that the worst harm had occurred not because of lack of rules, but because rules had been quietly bent and ignored. The individual responsible remained largely unnamed in public records. Legal language reduced actions to charges and diagnoses. Motives were debated endlessly. Some called it illness, others called it evil. Many refused labels altogether. What unsettled people most was not the act itself, but how ordinary it had looked from the outside. A trusted professional, a familiar face, someone who fit perfectly into the rhythm of care. Experts later described the case as a failure of collective responsibility, not because everyone was guilty, but because too many people felt something was wrong and assumed someone else would address it. Small doubts were postponed, minor anomalies normalized. Silence grew layer by layer until it felt permanent. The West Wing was demolished quietly, equipment removed, walls broken down, debris hauled away before most staff arrived. By the end of the week, the space no longer existed. Floor plans were updated again. New offices were planned. The past was buried under blueprints and concrete, yet stories remained. Night staff still spoke in lowered voices about that side of the building. Some claimed the air felt colder nearby. Others dismissed it as memory playing tricks. But memory has a way of anchoring itself to place even after the place is gone. Investigators closed their files. Reporters moved on. Public attention faded, as it always does. New stories replaced old ones, but for those connected, the case never truly ended. It became a reference point, a reminder of what can happen when control is valued over compassion and reputation over truth. Years later, the case is taught quietly in ethics courses and training sessions, often without names, often without emotion. Reduced to lessons and bullet points, yet behind those summaries are real people who never returned home. Families who waited for answers that arrived long after funerals. Staff who learned that doing nothing can sometimes be the most harmful choice. The West Wing is gone now, but its warning remains. That danger does not always arrive loudly. Sometimes it wears familiarity. Sometimes it hides in routine. Sometimes it depends not on action, but on the absence of it. And if there is a lesson left behind, it is this. Healing requires more than skill and structure. It requires the courage to question what feels normal, to speak when silence is easier, to remember that systems do not protect people. People protect people. Because somewhere else, another hallway is quiet tonight. Another shift runs smoothly. Another routine unfolds without incident. And the only thing standing between safety and harm is whether someone chooses to look closer when something feels just slightly wrong.